The Falcons finally got under center on offense against the Saints. What does it mean for their quarterback and coaching staff for 2025 and beyond?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, I am your humble host, Aaron Freeman, and welcome back to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Locked On Podcast Network, of course, is now the number one sports podcast network on the planet, and therefore in the galaxy until those Zorbians come for our throne. Today's Locked On Falcons is, of course, brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet just $5. And if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. So today's Locked On Falcons, we will be looking at the numbers for this new look Falcons under center offense from this impressive win against the New Orleans Saints. How impressive was it is debatable depending on what perspective you come from. But, we're going to operate because it was one of the more complete victories of the Falcons this season, even if it was against one of the worst opponents they faced this season. We'll take what we can get. Beggars cannot be choosers. And we'll talk about how this under center offense, what does that mean for Michael Penix's past and future, in addition to Kirk Cousins' present? As well as what does it mean for the coaching staff's future? Because is the current present continuation of the present going to be enough to save their jobs? We'll break that all down. But before we get there, I do want to thank all of you that make Locked On Falcons and so many other podcasts across the number one sports podcast network. Of course, Locked On, your first listen each and every day. We call you the everydayers. You are the reason why we are number one. And all you got to do to become an everydayer, subscribe and follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to get the latest episode as soon as it is available. So as we discussed on yesterday's rapid reaction to the Falcons Week 12 Saints win, the Falcons unveiled a new look offense with an increased usage of under center as well as an increased usage of play action passing, things that some people have been calling for. We have been certainly on the play action bandwagon for pretty much, 7 years at this point in time. It's been a long time. And the under center stuff, depending on, we weren't necessarily pushing for that in the ways that other people were, but certainly, was curious to see if that would help their offense. And it did. Depending on, if you're counting spikes and kneel downs and all that stuff, but basically the numbers I will throw at you guys. The Falcons utilize under center against the Saints on about 53% of their offensive snaps. And they utilize play action on 32% of those snaps. And that's major upticks from what they were prior to this past Sunday, which combined over the previous 10 games of the season, the Falcons were under center for 5% of their snaps and utilized play action on about 18% of their snaps. So we're talking basically doubling their play action rate and, whatever 10 times the number or 9 times the number of under center reps than before. And, the play action is not that new just because there has been an uptick in play action usage since the Week 8 loss to the Miami Dolphins, the last time Kirk Cousins started a game. Over the last 4 games, including the Saints game combined, the Falcons' play action rate has been about 25% of their plays, which is roughly league average, which is something that we were wanting to see from this offense, throughout the offseason. And it's, as we discussed throughout the offseason, it has contributed to the Falcons being a much more consistent and effective offense over these last 4 games. The Falcons, specifically on play action plays, are second in EPA on play action, and they're 10th in success rate on play action over the last 4 games combined. And we talked last week about how, that improvement in terms of play action, its growth and effectiveness is a big part of why the offense has looked better over the last 4 games, right? Has been much more consistent. They've been able to generate a total of 13 explosive plays over the last 4 games, which I believe is tied for the 11th most in the NFL in that span. And 8 of those 13 explosive plays, those 20-plus yard plays, have come via play action, 3 to Kyle Pitts, 3 to Drake London, and 2 to Darnell Mooney. And that's led to the Falcons averaging roughly 25 points per game over the last 4 weeks, which basically makes them a borderline top 10, a top 10 to 12-ish offense is basically what 25 points per game is going to get you. And so if it's not clear from all the stats that I'm throwing at you, essentially, right, the Falcons offense is finally starting to live up to the hype. And the play action to me has been a big part of that over the last month. And we'll see if the under center can kind of keep that going by enhancing the play action. That's basically, if you go back to the conversation we had on this podcast during the bye week, when we were talking about under center versus pistol and shotgun and all that stuff, right? We basically said the main reason why you want to play under center is because it's in theory going to enhance your play action passing game, because it's going to better sell your run action. Because generally speaking, teams only get under center to run the football and or to throw play action passes. I think the stat I cited then was like 70% of all passes operating under center are play action passes. So, that's the reason why you want to get under center. Now, another notable observation from Sunday with the under center offense was that Tyler Algier was much more effective in the run game working under center than Bijan Robinson was. Tyler Algier had 11 carries and 36 yards, so 3.3 yards per carry under center, but he had a 45% success rate, which was a very healthy number. Meanwhile, Bijan had 7 carries under center for 15 yards, a 2.1 yards per carry with a 29% success rate. And so this all kind of adds fuel. The fact that the Falcons were, leaning so heavily on pistol throughout the early portion of the season for the first 10 games of the season. And the stated reasons for that were basically because of Michael Penix being their quarterback, and that was something that was a better fit for his skill set, and Bijan Robinson being their primary running back. And that was the stated reason for the pistol and running so much out of the pistol, because that was, what Bijan was best in. And at least this game against the Saints seems to basically confirm that. Now, that has led to a lot of people on this Monday, as I'm recording this, at least based off of the tweets I saw, a lot of people being a lot more upset about a victory Monday, especially coming off of a Saints win, than you typically see, at least on Falcons Twitter, right? A lot of people big mad that the Falcons, quote unquote, finally went to this offense only after Michael Penix went down to injury, with a lot of people believing that this is the offense that the Falcons should have been running the entire time under Michael Penix, with a large contingent of Falcon fans that still believe that basically the pistol is the reason why the offense has been held back, all these weeks, right? And certainly this game didn't help throw cold water on that fire when it comes to that, even though like the data, it's one game, but anyway, doesn't matter. And so, I think that narrative about the pistol versus under center, as I stated, 2 months ago, I think is overblown, but there is a kernel of truth to it, I guess you could say. But like, it was clear to me from the jump that Michael Penix wasn't necessarily comfortable with operating under center, and the New Orleans game kind of confirms that. And so that leads to, various interpretations of that information, right? And I think some people look at that as, oh, that's a sign of the Falcons coaching Penix right, and other people look at it as more of an indictment of the Falcons coaching, and we'll debate where I kind of fall on that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Now, the NBA season is back, and there's no better place to get in on that NBA action than with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Whether you missed that opening tip-off or you're just looking to ride the hot hand, FanDuel has all the live bets, from everything from who's going to score next to those fourth quarter comebacks, and you can combine those live bets into a same game parlay for a shot at a bigger payout. So whether it's the NBA, college basketball, college football, the NFL, FanDuel has it all. And if you're looking to bet this upcoming Falcons-Jets game, the Falcons are currently 2.5-point favorites over the Jets. And it's a great opportunity to join FanDuel, because new customers will get $300 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. So you want to throw $5 on the the Falcons covering that line or not covering that line. And if it wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets. So head on over to FanDuel.com to sign up, download the app, and play your game with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. And today's episode is also brought to you by John Foy and Associates. When you get hurt on a job, do you know what you're entitled to? Attorney John Foy does. Whether it's lost wages, medical bills, or rehabilitation therapy, you should be getting all this and more. The system doesn't make it easy, but John Foy and Associates does. Every day, Attorney John Foy and Associates help people get the money and benefits that they deserve after they've been hurt on the job. When it comes to workers' comp, it pays to know what you're entitled to. The strong arm can get you the help and the proper medical attention, pay off your medical bills, and get you on a path to good health. Let the strong arm cut through the insurance company nonsense and fight to get you every dollar. Call John Foy and Associates today at 404-400-4000. That's 404-400-4000, or visit johnfoy.com to get started. They don't just settle, they win. Get the strong arm. Call Attorney John Foy and Associates today. Before we continue today's Locked On Falcons, I want to thank each and every one of you that's an everydayer of this podcast that makes this podcast your first listen. You, again, are the reason why Locked On is the #1 sports podcast network in the galaxy. All right. And Andromeda, we're coming for you too. We got the #1 spot on Milky Way Unlock. Andromeda, we are coming for you in a billion years. We're going to be #1 in 2 galaxies, baby. And there's like 4 people that are like, oh, I understand that reference. And I appreciate the 4 of you that are aware that the Milky Way and Andromeda galaxy are going to combine in, I don't know, 4 billion, 5 billion years or whatever it is. Oh, I love going off script on this podcast for bits that only like 3 people will get a very sensible chuckle out of. But anyway, speaking of bits, actions speak louder than words. And the Falcons, while they've been saying it with their words, if you've been paying attention, and we've talked about this multiple times, it's been mentioned on broadcasts of games that the Falcons' pistol usage is related to this coaching staff feeling like that's the best fit for their personnel. And you kind of had to go on that word before, but at least the Saints game, basically the actions match the words, right? We now have our first truly substantial data point that backs up those words with data that suggests that they were kind of right, seemingly based off of the success that the under center offense had with the current personnel, whether we're talking Tyler Algier over Bijan Robinson, talking Kirk Cousins over Michael Penix or whatever. Obviously, I know the pushback was like, we didn't really try before, so how do we know they were more, that whole thing. But, when it comes to the Falcons not utilizing under center with Penix in the lineup, we were talking about this back in week 3. I believe it was after week 3. And so this is something that the everydayers have known for 2 months. And this is another reason why you got to become an everydayer and support the #1 podcast network in the galaxy and one of the shows, because you get this information 2 months before everybody else is like, oh, this is a thing now. But, I've seen over the last 24 hours that a lot of people have been posting like one play of Michael Penix, whether it's at Washington or last year against the Giants, of him going under center and making a throw and being like, well, that's proof that he can do it. And it's like, one play doesn't really show you proof of a guy being able to do it, because this has been the talking point on this podcast for over a month, for the better part of the last 2 months, when we've been talking about evaluating Michael Penix and talking about his ability to turn his back to the defense off of play action. And like, as we've just been discussing that entire time prior to, this season, there have been examples of Penix doing it at a high level. And then, but the problem is there's just as many, if not more, examples of him not doing it at a high level. And so again, that's why we say showing one positive play is not telling the full story. You're just kind of cherry pick. Like, I could sit here and post one play of Penix throwing an interception against Washington, not under center, but turning his back to the defense, and then people will be like, well, that whole thing. So that's how that works. So the question, of course, is going to be, shouldn't this coaching staff had tried to work Penix under center as a way to develop him? And I think that makes sense. But at the same time, like, I don't think it's the indictment of the coaching as much as some people would like to try to spin it, right? Because we know that good coaching at its simplest is just putting players in a position to succeed. And especially this season in 2025, going into the season when there was so much pressure and urgency to win, and you have a first year starting quarterback, I can understand why this coaching staff felt like they could fast track Penix's development by getting him to do things that he was more comfortable and familiar with, which is the shotgun and pistol, which is what, from my understanding, and again, I don't have the hard data to support this, but some data to support it, that basically over 90% of his snaps in college came either in shotgun or pistol. And so I understand why the coaching staff was like, we're not going to try to square peg this guy. We're not going to try to force his development, and it'll be a smoother transition. And we can work on some of that stuff in the future, but that's not our primary goal this upcoming season. And so, like, to me, that is an issue that I think you as an organization, you as a coaching staff, you as a player really have to kind of hone in on during the offseason. And so, to me, if there was a misstep by this coaching staff, it was not trying to force, not basically saying to Michael Penix or going into the offseason being like, we're going to try to be more of an under center offense this year because we know that that's going to enhance our play action passing attack. And we know that because we listen to Locked On Falcons, we know that unlocking the play action passing attack is the key to our success this upcoming season. And so we need to go into this offseason and really work on Michael Penix's footwork and all these various things in April, May, June, July, and August to get us ready for September to unleash this thing. And that's kind of how I sort of see it, as opposed to something that, we'll just start doing it in September, and by the time we get to November, we'll figure it out. It's like, that can happen. Obviously, the more reps you get, the better in theory you should get at doing certain things, but it's kind of hard to do it in season because so much of the in season work is just like, what do we need to do specifically this week in order to game plan for this upcoming opponent that we have? We have basically 3 to 5 days to install whatever variations of the offense we want to do. And so if that under center offense isn't already hardwired into your offense during the course of the offseason, it's going to be hard to kind of, integrate that into your offense on a, week to week basis, especially with a quarterback that's not used to it. Now with Kirk Cousins, it's different just because, Kirk has done that, for the basically a dozen years. And it was only in Atlanta where the Falcons were like, we're not going to do the thing that Kirk's been doing for a decade plus at this point in time. But, that is, to me, going to be the interesting thing. And so because that is, to me, more of an off-season sort of coaching point, I guess you could say, that's where it matters, where Penix dealing with this ACL injury, potentially has some downside, because if that is something that the Falcons were planning on doing this all season, as we have been discussing, whether we're talking about Michael Penix with this current coaching staff or a different coaching staff, was like, oh, well, we need to develop certain things with Michael Penix being able to turn his back to defense. That's something that he needs to work on in off season, because he's now going to be spending most, if not all, of the off season rehabbing. He's not going to be able to work on those things, right? And so that's why we sit here going like, this injury is not just, Penix just tore his ACL or partial tear of his ACL. He'll be back and everything will pick up where we left off. It's like, no, there needs to be still significant development for Penix, and he's not going to get that really at all next year. And so it's hard to question whether or not he's going to make the improvements that he needs to make ahead of 2026. So that is certainly a continued topic of discussion about Penix's future, which leads to whether or not Penix is the future for this football team. And that's why, folks like myself, well, I can't speak for other folks, but I can speak for myself, are not as, it feels like to a large swath of listeners that we have just kind of abandoned ship on Michael Penix. And it's not because it's like, oh, he can't be successful, but now he's even further behind the 8 ball. If this is something that the Falcons want to do more of Michael Penix in the future, operating under center, it's going to be a lot harder to do with him, being injured than it would be if he was healthy. So all of this to say about the coaching point, all of this is just, regardless of, what you think. We will continue to see people using this, regardless of where you land on it, as fuel for their agenda, right? If you're wanting to indict this coaching staff and basically, as so many people have and do, and look at everything about this team as an indictment of this coaching staff, you'll spin this whole under center and not utilizing Penix under center as an indictment of this coach. Oh, that's why this team is this. Why Penix is poorly coached. And then I've seen other people that are like, well, this is why Penix should have never been the answer at quarterback. They wasted a draft pick on a guy that couldn't do under center stuff, which is the norm in with guys coming out of college. But again, that's not going to impact people's agendas, right? So, my only agenda, as pretentious as it makes me sound, is truth. But if I do have a less pretentious agenda, it is that I think the Falcons need a hard reset after this season. And I don't think this specific issue about the under center offense helps or really hurts that agenda. But if this offense is here to stay and it has success over the next 6 games, and is able to operate like a borderline top 10 offense, that could hurt my agenda, which is, that type of success could lead to this coaching staff being retained. And so let's talk more about that as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons.
Today's show is brought to you by our friends over there at Peloton. Look, folks, it's time to break through the busiest time of the year with a brand new Peloton cross-training Tread Plus that's powered by Peloton IQ. It's Peloton's most elevated technology and equipment yet that gives you real-time guidance, and it gives you endless ways to move, whether you want to work out by yourself or if you want to work out with your favorite instructor, like my personal favorite, Alex Toussaint. He always gets me fired up to tackle the day. And the thing I like about Peloton, it helps me achieve more in less times. They have features that help you plan, stay motivated, track your progress, and Peloton IQ also provides personalized workout plans and recommendations. That's something that I use right now during the busiest time of the year covering the NFL. They plan my workouts for me based on my mood, my vibe, and also my favorite instructors. So make sure you check it out and use it, because it also helps you correct your form in real time, and it maximizes your reps. It counts your reps so that you can do it smarter, safer, and more efficient. Let yourself run, lift, flex, push, and go. Explore the new Peloton cross-training Tread Plus at onepeloton.com.
So wrapping up today's Locked On Falcons, going back to last week, we spent a lot of time discussing how and why the Falcons should be headed for a reset, from top to bottom in this organization, whether we're talking about the front office, whether we're talking about the head coaching staff. We like to use the term reset. Others people like rebuild, retool, reload. Again, any reword that you want to go with, whatever floats your boat. But we say reset just because it doesn't necessarily have some of the connotation that some of those other rewords such. It's purposefully vague. It's just like, oh well, it's a reset, right? What that whole thing. But the gist of that conversation really was like, we, the royal we, myself and my ego, think that that's what's in the best interest of the Falcons long term, is to finally get that reset that they've been basically reluctant to do for the better part of the decade, which has coincided with their ongoing 7-year playoff drought, burgeoning on 8-year playoff drought. And this team has been avoiding that for that entire time at all costs, essentially operating for those 8 years now as if they're, 1 or 2 pieces away, and they just got to get those 1 or 2 pieces and they'll get over the hump. And, 8 years ago, that was to get back to the Super Bowl. And over the last 4 or 5 years, it's been mainly to get back into the playoffs. And that's basically the summary of what I talked about last week. So we won't rehash that whole thing. Now, whether you agree or disagree, is up to you. But it does appear that most fans, at least most listeners of this podcast, seem to be of the mindset that the Falcons should be moving on from this coaching staff at the very least after the season. It feels like, based off of some polling I've done, people are less reluctant to move on from the front office in terms of Terry Fontenot at this point in time. But I did put up a poll last night on YouTube for the Locked On Falcons community. basically asking, should this coaching staff keep their jobs after the Saints game? And 3% said yes, the Saints game changed my mind. 12% said maybe if they can keep on winning. 8% were kind of undecided. And then 77% were like, no, already made up my mind. They're done. So basically that tells you 3 out of 4 everydayers and non-everydayers of Locked On Falcons basically are of the same mindset that the Falcons should at the very least be resetting their coaching staff next year. My issue is I think a large portion of that is basically operating with the idea of like the only thing that we have to change, or the main thing that we have to change, is the coaching staff, and then we'll be right back to getting over the hump, so to speak. So to me, it's a more of a perpetuation of what we've been experiencing over the last 8 years. So we'll see on that front, but that is my suspicion. I can't confirm or deny that at this point in time. But as we sit here, it's only one game, so we don't want to count our chickens before they hatch, especially with the Falcons, who are notorious for, looking good one week and then looking terrible the next week. But if one win turns into 2 next week against the Jets, and now with the Bucks on the current struggle bus, looking like the 2022 to 24 Falcons, which is starting fast and fizzling, that week 15 game against the Bucks on Thursday night looks a lot more winnable, a lot more meaningful for the Falcons today than it looked, for the better part of the last 5-6 weeks. There's definitely a scenario now where the Falcons could win more games than they lose over these final 6 games. And is that enough to give ownership an excuse to not give themselves a hard look in the mirror that at least me, myself, and my ego think they should be doing here on this podcast, and just kind of do the thing that we discussed last week that we were worried about, is that they could just easily chalk up 2025 to, well, injuries happened and they got off to a slow start because they had a first-year starting quarterback, but by years in, they kind of figured it out, and we're going to pick up where we left off. And again, based off of Arthur Blank's history, that to me is a real possibility, right? It's been a real possibility this whole time, but because you're on a 5-game losing streak, it feels less and less like a possibility every single week. But then the minute you win, it's like, oh, okay. And then we still got a lot of games left to be played. So I don't want to sit here and be like, oh, but just because they won this one game, they're going to win the next 5 or anything like that. But you know what I mean when it comes to that. And so because of it's only one game, we're not going to spend too much time worrying about it right now. We'll wait and see how they respond to this one positive game against the Jets next week, and then we'll see what they look like against Seattle and Tampa Bay. But I just remember joking a few weeks back about the most quote-unquote Falcon-y outcome for this season, meaning, what's the worst case scenario for the team? And the assumption would be, oh, they just stink and they go 3-14. And it's like, no, that's not the worst case scenario, because then you would have a much more clear-cut answer on what you should do moving forward. And you couldn't sit here and chalk yourself up, after a 3-4. Oh, we're actually really close. Like, you couldn't do that after a 3-14 season. Instead, the worst case is the Falcons figure out a way to start winning some games, as they seemingly did on Sunday, so that you don't have that clear-cut answer, so that you do wind up just being like, oh, they won 7 or 8 games and they really finished strong. They finished 5-3 in the second half of the season. Hey, if you can go 5-3 in the second half, and do that in the first half, guess what that means? That means you win 10 games, right? Like, that's the most Falcon-y outcome. And, you do worry a little bit more now today that they are headed down that path. And, I'm going to be sitting here on the podcast this offseason, basically knowing that they're going to do this again and be like, oh, well, they're 1 or 2 pieces away. They finally figured out the play action, which is what we were talking about. And, this offense started performing like a top 10 unit. And if we can just get a couple of other pass catchers in the building, we just brought in KJ Osborne. That's going to solve so many problems. And, we'll sit here and convince ourselves that, knowing that it's not going to work, knowing it's just going to be more of the same of the last 8 years, like, it's not going to change. And, this year it's going to be different. And it's like, no, it's not going to be different. It's just going to be the same. But it's just, we just do it to ourselves every year. But because the offseason is so long, you do kind of eventually, once you get to like May and June, you do kind of eventually like, well, maybe it could, wind up working for us.
Well, did it work for those people? No, it never does. I mean, these people somehow delude themselves into thinking it might, but it might work for us.
So that is basically being a Falcons fan and covering this team is just constant delusion. So we'll see. Well, again, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. You know, we still got a lot of football left to be played. We still got decisions to be made this offseason, but that's what it feels like. The cover of this team is like, oh, this never works. But you know what? Maybe it'll work for us. Yeah, we'll see. So, guys, that's going to do it for us here on today's Locked On Falcons. Tomorrow we'll be back with an all-22 review, where we'll probably get more into the nitty-gritty of some of this play-action stuff and, you know, seeing tight end leak concepts and, you know, Yankee concepts. And I'm like, oh, Zach, what are you doing? Oh, getting so hot and bothered in here looking at these play-action concepts that have been staples for the Falcons offense for years. And then Arthur Smith and Zach Robinson come into the building and decide, you know, to be true patriots, right? And say, no, we're not doing that anymore. Right. So that will be potentially a topic of conversation, but we also potentially talk about this defense and their 4-man rush. And are they turning a corner, or did they, you know, beat up on a bad Saints O-line? I guess we'll find out more this upcoming week against the Jets, who at least in theory have a better offensive line that better matches up with our 4-man pass rush, just because our edge rushers and whatnot. So we'll see on that front, but that will all be in store for you this week. I don't know if we're going to do a Friday episode because of the holiday. Most weeks y'all don't listen to the Black Friday episode, even if I post one. Most years I do post one, but we're probably not going to do one. At least I'm not planning on doing one right now. So we'll have the all-22 review tomorrow. We'll have the crossover Thursday for you guys on Thanksgiving or Wednesday night on YouTube and whatnot. So that's probably what's in store for you the rest of the week. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen by checking us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, so you don't miss any of that upcoming commentary. And of course, check out the Locked On NFL podcasts, giving you the scoop on all things Week 12, all things holiday, all things Week 13. It is all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And again, thank you for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network in the galaxy. Talk to you later.